ideas, your comments. And as Hazel was saying, we just want to advance the work on poverty. It's a key issue in our region, okay, which sees two extremes, with low poverty rates in certain countries and very high poverty rates in other countries within the same region into it, and then we get into this medium things. It's important also because effective policy, fiscal policy in the space, and what is it? So as long as we can know drivers of it properly, magnitude of it properly, where does it lie, is extremely important so that we can have a better advising to our member states how to curb the poverty itself. The same thing, it's extremely important. It's to us the value. There is a lot of things are also being done in the region in terms of other drivers that can also impact, which I come to the multidimensional poverty. It's the quality of life at the end of the day. And it's interesting part in Lebanon at one time, it doesn't matter how much money you can have, okay, there's certain services you are not able to get. For example, medicine was not available, fuel for transportation was not available, it becomes so hard. COVID showed us also that money by itself is not the issue. You might not have inhalator oxygen, you might not have a bed, even if you are the wealthiest. You can see some people in India, they said with all our networks, we couldn't have a bed in a hospital into it. So this is also to lead us also from the money metric to get into the other part of the multidimensional poverty, the other quality of life. It's key. We want to advance the work that has been done, and with your insights and thoughts will be very helpful for us. And just as the UN also working on beyond GDP, on other issues and multidimensional vulnerabilities into it. That's why ASQA is embarking also on a very important social topic, is the poverty, and as it leads on also on inequality as we move along. Just want to let you know that we are also founding member of the Alliance of Hunger and Poverty that Brazil has initiated, and we have also brought in several of our member states also because of our work that we are doing and we believe in, and we're just taking it further as we move along. I close in here. Please, your deliberations are very important. Your comments are very important for us. Our idea is we want to advance that work in a proper, technical, forward pathways into it, so that it will enrich the report, but it also will enrich policymakers as this report will be out as we're coming out into it. Let alone also poverty is a very political issue, and our region is extremely sensitive. Even in rich countries, when we write it, they become sensitive to it. Middle income countries also are sensitive to it. Talking Jordanians, they say, but that's too much, too low, stuff like that. We said it's not only the number, it's just the direction that we need to take, let alone the least developed countries and the poor countries also wants a space how to move forward and improve their livelihood. So this will be the couple of hours that we will be hearing from you are very important to us. And thank you for coming and joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Dashi. Again, very pleased to see you all here. It's very important for us to have this meeting when we're embarking on this topic, and I also want to echo the notion that we would want to have this as an informal but also candid and frank discussion. So please let us know what you think and be critical. Because when you're embarking on this rethinking exercise, we need to be critical. We need to re-examine narratives, hypotheses, assumptions, and that's what we intend to do today. I think what I'm going to do is just have a dash through. We've seen the report, the draft report, still work in progress. But I want to just walk you through the essentials of what it is that we're trying to do. So it's going to be maybe about half an hour or max 40 minutes of just going through, not the details, not the mundane technicalities, but really the key issues. So you can then take us back to that in your commentary. So yeah, so it's just some brief introductory remarks. Yeah.
Do you want to do a little run around?
Yes. That's
I knew you said that.
I forgot. So why don't we start with you then, and we go around the table.
Hi, I'm James Foster. I measure stuff. Thank you.
I'm Sabine Alkire from OP in Oxford.
Dorothée Boucan-Fuseau, UM6B, Université Mohamed VI Polytechnique, Rabat.
Tuami Abdel Khalid in the same university in Rabat.
I'm Corinne Mitchell, also from OP.
Terry McKinley, used to be in UNDP, now retired, still active.
Salim Jahan, ex-UNDP.
Sanjay Reddy, New School, and kind of ex-UNDP.
Now Khalid Busmail with UN as well.
Is there anybody?
Yes, we're going to go, but Vlad?
Vladimir Hosni with Khalid, the same poverty team at ESCO.
So why don't we start with online? We have Jinan. We can go in the same order. Jinan?
I'm Jinan. I've been with ESCO for 3 years. I'm a researcher, data analyst.
They have?
I'm Rihab Baltajer. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm an economic researcher at UNESCO since 2021.
Hassan?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Hassan, and I work for the poverty team at ESCO.
Michael, I think?
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Fhaile, and I've been with the ESCO for 3 months now as an individual contractor.
I don't know who else is there. Is it Maria?
Yes, hello. I'm Maria Hatte. I'm working on the Development Challenges project at ESCO, and I've been there since 2019.
We also have Marco from our social cluster. Marco?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Marco Schäfer. I'm leading ESCO's work on social protection.
Osama?
Good morning, everyone.
Yes, good morning. Osama Safa. I head the social justice team.
And Teresa, who unfortunately couldn't join us today
Yes.
because of cancellation.
Yes, hi, good morning. I'm Teresa Munzi. I'm the Director of Operations of the Least Luxembourg Income Study.
And I think that's it, right? Did we miss out on anybody online? No.
Good morning.
Okay. So if I haven't mentioned your name, can you please introduce yourselves?
Yes, good morning. I'm Rima Abdel Khalid, Senior Research Assistant. I work with the poverty team at ESCO.
Sama?
Good morning, everyone. Sama Sleiman, a statistician and research assistant at ESCO.
And I think Sukaina, you're...
Yes, thank you, Khalid. Hello, everyone. This is Sukaina Al-Nasrawi. I'm the lead of the Sustainable Urban Development portfolio at UNESCO, and I really look forward to the discussion today.
Okay, so as I said, I'm just going to try to focus on the key messages here for the next half hour, just some brief introductory remarks, and then zooming in on the main results. The growth and inequality drivers are going to, I'm going to leave that to the next session for Vlad and Rehab to present, and just basically go into forecasts and scenarios before we can just close with a few policy related issues. So the first question, I guess, is why are we doing this? I mean, why is ESCO, a regional commission, embarking on a report on global poverty? That's a kind of question, I guess, would naturally ask in this context. One is our mandate. I mean, we are actually mandated to contribute to global thinking from a regional perspective. So that's, when we think about the important issues in the SDG context and the World Development Agenda, poverty is obviously at the forefront. And the other thing is that we have been working in the region for almost more than a decade now on the poverty issues, whether money-metric or multidimensional. So we have actually gathered a bit of knowledge, I would say, on how to address these issues at the national and regional level, which puts us, I think, in a position to be able to contribute to that debate. But ultimately, the objective is to support our countries. Okay, so the ultimate objective is to go back to member states, our core member states, and armed with these new perspectives, to be able to inform policies and decision making at the national level. Now, this is very useful in our region because of data limitations. Not a lot of countries in our region actually produce surveys, household income expenditure surveys, on a regular basis, and even when they do, they don't have national poverty lines. And as you know, in a region where conflict is driving poverty rises, you want to be able to have these kinds of tools. For example, even in the richest countries, where it was assumed that poverty was non-existent, Gulf countries, we were able to say that no, in fact, that is about 10% of the population of the Gulf region, nationals, and I emphasize nationals, who are living below what ESQA deems as appropriate cost of basic needs poverty line. So with this, we're able to produce a regional narrative, because the global tools that we had were missing. They were not allowing us to give that kind of perspective. So there is a need, but the global tool metrics were not allowing us to fulfill our function of highlighting the importance of the issue. Before we get into the specifics, of course, as you know, poverty experts, that this is not an easy or trivial task. You have so many difficulties, surveying frequencies, the issues related to PPPs and their conversions. Sanjay, I'm sure, has a lot to say on that. Harmonizing data for comparisons over time, expenditure versus income, all of these things required us to do a lot of technical work before we get to this report. But what we've made sure to do is that we've documented everything. So we have 171 countries, around 2,400 surveys, everything that the bank has, the World Bank has, and we are grateful for them, I should say. Unfortunately, you weren't able to join us today, but we are grateful for the technical knowledge that they brought to this issue, because we couldn't have done this without that basis and that foundation. So that is an acknowledgement that I think is due. But we also added to what the bank has with our own survey analyses from the region, with countries that we have access to, especially, for example, the GCC. So, would you like to introduce yourself, Julie?
Yes, I'm Francisco Ferreira from
so, Francisco is, of course, well-known figure in the poverty arena, and so we're glad to have you here with us as well. We just started, Francisco, so...
Sorry that I'm listening.
Now, what we do differently from the bank is, in terms of our projections, in terms of our nowcasting, we apply what we call a pass-through, a growth pass-through. So that's also one of the background papers. We don't just take whatever happens at the national level and apply it at the micro level. We apply this growth pass-through. And it's quite important, because in many countries what happens at the GDP level of private expenditure is very different than what happens at the survey level. So we apply that in terms of our growth forecasting. And also, we have a simple, but I think interesting way to project inequality. It's not a trivial issue, projecting Gini's, But we have a multivariate simple regression to do that, and then we have a Kakwani transformation to basically take it to the P&Ls. So all of these details are in the background publication. So you will find them; they were shared with you, and we can again get into the nitty-gritties. But and there were also 3 major expert group meetings that helped us get to this point. So with this, let me dive straight into what is it that we are proposing. At the heart of it, we are interested in defining money metric poverty in a way that is closer to the manner in which it is measured at the country level. So we like the idea that national poverty lines, the way the countries define their cost of basic needs, is used as an anchor. And the idea is simple. The idea is that we believe that these patterns, of the way in which countries define their national cost of basic needs has a certain relationship with average expenditure. And based on Engel's proposition, we believe that this basically rises at a decreasing rate. So it's a very simple, intuitive assumption here, that we have a theoretical basis that we can utilize, that, as you get richer, the cost of basic needs would rise, but not at the same rate as income. And that is essentially the key insight that we have here. There's nothing new about that. It's been, I think, mentioned several papers and in academic literature before, but that's what we embody. And also, in alignment with the Atkinson report, we like the idea of having absolute and relative in the same definition. So we also have this floor of 215 as a basis. Anybody, anywhere in the world who earns below 215 is definitely poor. Now, if you look at the graph on the left, you'll see the basic relationship that I'm referring to, which is basically between the national poverty lines and income, and this is, of course, survey income. And you can already see the concavity in the relationship, which visually implies, that this relationship that I'm mentioning, that it tends to increase with income, but at a decreasing rate. Now, here is the point. Even if you don't visually see that, you can also impose that theoretically. Okay, so this is again our conviction that because the problem in many of the richer countries, you don't have absolute. These are absolute poverty lines, by the way. Okay, so there's nothing relative here. That's very important to mention. But absolute poverty lines, as you know, in the richer countries are very scarce to find. I mean, most of them they adopt relative poverty lines. But you can still see the concavity here. Now, what you have on the right-hand side is when you apply the ESPA regression, which is basically the log-log transformation in order to get that concavity, whether by income or by region. Now, the closest alternative we have is the World Bank Societal Poverty Line, which is basically the same idea of having the 215 as a floor, but then you have the relative half of the median as a fixed relationship between income and poverty. Now, the problem with that approach is that it doesn't, in our opinion, measure poverty. It's more of an inequality measure. And that's why you get, when you look at the relationship between the results you have when you use the ESPA poverty line and the World Bank Societal poverty line, you get a gross overestimation of poverty using the societal poverty line compared to the ESPA poverty line, and vice versa for the poorer, lower middle income countries. So while the results might correlate globally, but when you look at the details for country groups, you'll see that our approach is much better for measuring poverty, especially for those two groups of countries. The second thing we do, which is interesting, is that we look at the poor not
one group, but as a diverse group. So in this report, you'll see that we have the global definition of destitution of people living below $1.5 a day. And we also look at the extreme poor as going beyond the 250. And that's an important insight. Because think about it this way. I mean, even the bank, I think Martin Revalian would say would have said, the late Martin Revalian would have said that, if you live below 215, you're definitely poor, but it doesn't, extremely poor. But it doesn't mean that everybody, that captures everybody who is extremely poor worldwide. So how do we do that? How do we capture the extreme poor in the upper middle income and high income countries? Well, our proposal is if you're above the 215, but below 2/3 of our anchor, the ESCO poverty line, then you're extremely poor. Okay? Why 2/3? Well, if it's a bit arbitrary, but we can argue by looking at the way and the consumption patterns in the countries, upper middle and high income countries. 2/3 of it usually goes to the very basic needs in most countries. So there is a little bit of scientific evidence for that. And then, of course, you have the group who are above the extreme poverty line by ESCWA definitions and below the ESCWA poverty line, and we can refer to those as moderately poor. But here's another key insight. That regression that we saw, that relationship is basically based on the national poverty lines. And those national poverty lines are mainly reflecting the bank's lower poverty line. Okay? So that's actually the country's own measure or definition of something closer to extreme poverty. Okay? And in the countries where you had both the upper poverty line, again, all of this is back to the bank's methodology, and the lower poverty line, there was a 50% gap on average, and we did that exercise for 9 Arab countries, middle income, upper income, and low income countries. Okay, in order to determine the vulnerability line. Okay, so that's why we have this 50% more to capture the vulnerable. You might as well call them the moderately poor if you want, but that's a subjective issue. So some people would say vulnerable, some people would say, you can easily shift the categories and they could easily become the moderately poor, but we prefer to call them vulnerable. And then, of course, there's a group of non-poor. We are dealing with group data, so we're going to miss out on a lot of categories and a lot of narratives. Of course, we're not going to be able to talk about the disability, the aging population characteristics, women, rural poverty, the working poor. All of these things are very important. We acknowledge the limitations of not being able to address this in this report. Now, let me go straight into the results. Here is basically what I think Sanjay, you and I, that was thanks to you 10 years ago, this graph, the poverty, what you call the poverty sweep. Basically looking at world poverty across all poverty lines from $1 a day to $15 a day, 1995, 2024. You can see here the dominance of the results, implying that in 2024 the world is less poor than it was in 1995, regardless of the choice of poverty line. That's the first key insight. There's no doubt that the world is less poor than it was in 1995. Now, of course, the gap between the lines reflects the choice of poverty line matters, because the story will differ whether or not you're evaluating at $2.15 or at $7 or $8 a day. But that's another issue. And here's another main result. And this is a very important graph because I think it summarizes the whole narrative. You can see here at the global level, definitely destitution declined, and extreme poverty using the revised ESCWA definition also declined. But our definition of moderate poverty and vulnerability has also commensurately increased. Okay. So this is a new narrative that I think is important, which implies that the conventional wisdom on the exploding middle class needs to be re-examined. Okay, because that's been repeated often in the literature. There's been an exploding global middle class. I don't think that would be accurate, according at least to our perspective. The other thing that we want to emphasize is that these results are very sensitive to your choice of region. Almost all of these fantastic results are driven by East Asia, China, to a lesser extent South Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa used to do well up until 2010, but when you get into, of course, North America being stagnant, they've transitioned a while back. Latin America, you can see a little bit of poverty reduction, but not so spectacular. And then the Arab region, you can see a reversal, which again highlights the need to have these kind of metrics from a regional perspective, because you can see the Arab region here as the distinct outlier. Another way to present these results is to look at them from an income group perspective, and you can see also that the narrative is very different from the upper middle income group, lower middle income group, upper middle income, of course, being the fastest in terms of poverty reduction, versus the lower income countries, who, starting from 2010, you can see after nearly a decade and a half of poverty reduction, stagnation, and then poverty rise. So it's a very different narrative for low-income countries. Now let's zoom in on destitution. No one talks about destitution anymore. I mean, it's interesting. Interesting especially in light of the fact that we still have 300 million people who are living below $1.5 a day. And look at what happened to the Arab region. It's a phenomenal rise, of course, because of the conflicts. So now, basically, between Sub-Saharan Africa and the Arab region, you have more than 3/4 of the world's income poverty destitutes. Zooming in on the country level, nothing surprising here, but the nice thing about this methodology, even though maybe some people have reservation on ranking countries, but you can now, I think, do that with, of course, the usual caveats. So the poorest country in the world is Madagascar, followed by Congo, and the least poor country in the world is Iceland. And you can see here the mix of Arab countries being in both the poorest and the least poor countries worldwide, which again highlights the need for having this unique perspective in the Arab region. We have some of the richest and poorest countries worldwide. Again, in terms of the top deteriorations, and over the period from 95, the three highest deteriorations are in the Arab region: Yemen, Syria, and Somalia. Conflict. Interestingly, Egypt joins in as well, that group. That was a bit of a surprise. But nothing surprising about the top reductions here: China, of course, Uzbekistan coming in to top the table. So I'm going to stop here for the basic key stylized facts, and then Vlad will get into the growth, and Vlad will get into the growth analytics, because these results, as we know, any change in poverty is a result of two things happening. It's either a change in income distribution or a change in growth. But I want to go into the future. Okay, so this is the other interesting thing. So far, we've been talking about the past and the present, and I want to talk a little bit about the future. And I want to ask the question of what would it actually take to reduce poverty by half by 2030. It seems to be a rather ambitious goal and rather elusive, I would say, by now. But let's do that using the ESPA. Okay, so I'm using the ESPA poverty line now as the basis. And let's first look on the business as usual scenario. So assuming our forecasts from now until 2030, as I said, we're forecasting the Gini's using a simple model. We're also forecasting growth using our UN DESA growth rates, applying a pass-through. The world was at 31.8 in 2015, and if we just aspire to reduce that by half to 15.9, where are we expected to be in 2030? We're expected to be business as usual at 24.6. That leaves us with a gap of 8.7 percentage points. That's this graph. And you can see the differences and the levels and forecasts by region and by income group. And clearly, you can see the predicament of the low-income countries and the Arab region and sub-Saharan Africa very clear in this perspective. So now, let's regroup the countries, okay, based on another set of criteria. So let's group countries worldwide into 4 groups. Group 1, which has already achieved that target or well on way to achieve it, so they're within 3 percentage points of that target. Group 2, 4 to 10 percentage points, they need a nudge, can be done. Group 3, that's from 11 to 20%, that's going to be more difficult to do in less than 6 years. And then Group 4, who are over 20% of the target. And you can see the poverty rates for those groups and their gaps from the target accordingly. The interesting thing is that Group 2 and Group 3, 215, more or less the same poverty rates initially, right? There's only a 3 percentage point difference. I want to come back to that point later because I think it is important. Now, the good news, we have 2/3 of, or almost 3/4 of the world population in Group 1 and Group 2. Okay, so that's really, I think the report is not all bleak and dismal. There is, that hopeful message that, for many countries, even if you put that very high target of reducing poverty by half by 2030, a lot of the countries have either achieved that target or on way to achieve it. But then we ask the question of how much of a push do you actually need to get to that target? And so what we do here is we look at the level of growth that you would need to have, level of income, that we need to have, the level of growth and the level of Gini and the average annual changes that you will need to have in growth and distributional shocks in order to reach these targets. And the conclusion is that for Group 2, you're almost there. You don't have a problem with growth, you just need a little bit of a nudge with the distribution. For Group 3, you need a little bit of both. And for Group 4, it's just undoable. That's, there's no scenario that can actually get those countries realistically to the targets by 2030. So, now that we've looked at the situation where we are, where we're heading in the business as usual, where we need to go, the report then tries to ask the question of, well, how do we get there? How do we get to that desired scenario? And we have 3, if you will, areas for policy reform. 2 of them are dealing with that question, and then the third one has to deal with our principal recommendations for the post-2030 agenda. So obviously, you need to work on the proximate determinants of poverty. You need to work on growth and distribution. That's what countries need to do. And that takes us, of course, to macroeconomic policies. Now, if you're going to talk about poverty reduction at the national level, you always debate, as we know, between 2 perspectives, the growth story or the distribution story. And I want to show you this graph because this is actually an interesting way of summarizing the narrative. This is the poverty rate in 2021 versus what we call the inequality adjusted income challenge. Okay, so this is basically the Human Development Index income index adjusted for inequality. Okay, our inequality, our Gs, the ones that we produce at ESCO. And it's a phenomenally good relation. It's a really nice fit, don't you think? So the key message here is that if you want to predict poverty, it's really, your growth, your income level adjusted with, because those are the two things that affect poverty. I was surprised to see that fit, actually. So that might be another subject for our discussion. But it's intuitive. You either work on growth or distribution or both. And the question is, which one matters more? In our optimization model to get to these results, we kind of answered that question. You say, well, if you're more sensitive to growth, as most poor countries, so if your poverty is reduced more by incremental increases in growth, then work more on growth. If you're richer countries, typically, then you're more sensitive to distributional shifts, and you should work more on distribution. But this is a national level discussion. This is not something that you can have at the regional or global level. You're going to have to take these issues at the national level. But if we were to make recommendations based on the evidence that we have, based on the categories, then obviously groups 2 and 3 need to work more on progressive income and wealth taxation. And that's the key issue. Whereas for group 4, clearly they need support, and ODA will continue to play an important role. Now, another piece of good news is that the poverty gap as a share of total income of the top decile is not phenomenally large for those two groups, group 2 or group 3, which basically means that fiscal policies can play a role. And also, if you look at it as a share of the top wealth, top decile wealth, then you can also see that it's very much within feasible range to have an effective wealth taxation or income taxation policy. Another piece of good news is that there is a lot of room for direct taxation increase, especially in group 2 and group 3. So when you look at these levels, you can see that there is room for more direct taxation, less room for the VAT because of their higher share of the tax revenue. So that's another one of our key messages. But let me now shift to another important topic. All of this is basically about macro policies and help you get more resources to close the fiscal gap and do your cash transfers. But what about the driving, underlying forces that shape income poverty? And that's where we need a new perspective. Okay, so that's the part that I think, to be frank, still is a bit underdeveloped in the version that you have. We're working on it. My colleague Christian Aldridges, who unfortunately couldn't join us because he's on his way to Mauritania, is working on that. But this is a central message that we have in this report. But in order to highlight the importance of this message, we need to take another perspective, a human development capability approach perspective, which basically takes us to another piece of work by ESQA, the Development Challenges Framework, or the DCI, Development Challenges Index, which actually was also discussed in this very room 3 or 4 years ago. And basically what this is that we start, as we've done with Money Metrics, with the global framework, the Human Development Index, and we say that's great, we love it, but it's not enough. If you want to really broaden the horizon of development analytics, you need to bring in 3 things. You need to bring in quality-adjusted human development, so you need to adjust the income for quality, which basically means it's distributional power, healthy lives rather than life expectancy, and quality education rather than just being years of schooling. And then you get the quality-adjusted human development challenge index. And then you also get environmental sustainability as an integral part of the definition, not as an add-on or as a correlation variable, but as an integral part of the definition. And finally, governance. The right to have democratic governance principles, rule of law, participation, accountability respected, and the right to have effective government in place. That's the DCI, and these are the results when we do the correlation with our ESCWA poverty. And you can see here it's a nice fit, but you can also see the nonlinearity, which basically means that after a certain threshold, at least that's my interpretation, that after a certain level of challenges, if once you get from medium to the low level of challenges on the DCI, it's much easier for you to reduce income poverty. But the other piece of interesting news is that all of the countries that had good progress on reducing income poverty were also doing very well in reducing their DCI over the period from 2000 to 21. Very nice fit between healthy life and poverty and quality-adjusted education. Education and health are key drivers of income poverty. You know, you can argue causality runs in the other direction, but you know, that's another issue. The point is that there is a very strong relation. Also, environmental health, access, you know, to water, sanitation, things like that, pollution matters significantly when it comes to the relation with poverty. But so does climate change. As we know from the discussions going on in COP29, it's the poorest countries that bear the brunt of the impact of climate change. And the carbon emissions can testify to that. Finally, with governance, you don't have, which is not surprising, a very strong fit with democratic governance. It's still positive, but it's not that strong of a fit. You have a stronger fit with government effectiveness and income poverty. So, so that's something that we also wanted to highlight. Our policy conclusions. If there was one thing to recommend to Group 3, remember that graph that I said, you know, we need to go back to, that Groups 2 and 3, the difference between them was not their initial poverty rate, but in their ability in the business as usual to reduce poverty. Group 3 were constrained. Group 2 were nosediving when it comes to poverty. Well, if you look at these results, you know why. Because of the health and education challenge is very different, and the government effectiveness challenge is very different for these groups. So the policy recommendation for Group 3 is that you need to work on your education, health, and government effectiveness. But for Group 4, many of which are obviously conflict-affected, low-income countries, it's really back to the basics. And we can see in the Arab region the predicament that we are in with the vicious cycle of conflict and poverty. Palestine, Lebanon being prime examples, unfortunately, as we speak. So for those countries, it's, you know, basically political stability and working with the basics. You know, just having a functioning economy, just having the basic right to peace. So the key message that I think we want to emphasize in the revised draft is that if we agree that poverty is inherently multidimensional and is affected by a lack of quality health, education, sustainable environment, and good governance, this naturally leads us to the MPI and the capability approach. And that's this nice fit that we have between the global MPI and between our ESCWA extreme poverty lines and the ESCWA moderate poverty line. And it's a nice fit. It's not perfect. I don't want it to be perfect. I don't want there to be a perfectly strong correlation between income and multidimensional poverty. I want there to be a reasonable fit, but as you can see, many countries are either way above or way below that line, meaning that there is a difference between both approaches. Both approaches complement each other. And you can see how they complement each other at the national level. This is from our report, hopefully to be published this week in Egypt, the national MPI for Egypt, where we did the overlap exercise. And you can see that there's only 13% of the population who are both multidimensional and income poor. But the majority, a higher majority, 20% of the poor are money metric but not multidimensional, and 10% vice versa. That's important because when we advise the Egyptian government, we're going to tell them the first target group you need to focus on is that 13% that are poor regardless of whichever perspective you adopt. So that's basically takes us to my last slide, which is what is our message to the world 2030. Well, obviously we need to broaden the lens through which we look at money-metric poverty, and we've given an example of how to do that. It doesn't have to be the only example. It doesn't have to be, I mean, I'm sure there are other ways of doing it, but we believe that this system of metrics is conceptually sound, theoretically and empirically, and it makes more sense than any other existing alternative. Why? Because it's anchored to the way in which countries actually view and interpret and measure poverty. But we also argue that because of this necessary complementarity between income and multidimensional poverty approaches, that there needs to be a commensurate effort to measure multidimensional poverty at the global level. So whatever we do post-2030, we need to a complete overhaul of the way that we measure poverty worldwide. So, to conclude, that's my last slide. Income poverty is much higher than we think or thought. Global efforts, business as usual, is not working. And to address these challenges, you need definitely pro-poor fiscal policies in the short term to address the immediate proximate challenges, but only with a multidimensional approach can you address the root causes of income poverty. And of course, we need a new system of world poverty metrics. I hope I didn't take too much time, and I'll stop here and hand it over to the discussants.
Thanks to the authors, the organizers, and everyone else for the ability to comment now. So the report was really, as everyone would agree here, a very large undertaking with many moving parts. A lot of coordination went into its creation. There's a lot of good stuff that got me thinking about a number of items, and maybe go back to a little bit more of the monetary base that I started in and have been less focused on recently, but. Yeah, so given what I know, I'm going to be pretty narrow in my comments. My apologies to people who want broad strokes and so forth. I'm going to be trying to talk a little bit about measurement issues. I mean, you could actually toss out probably 90% of what I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's also presentational issues I think that we need to look at. There are measurement issues that I'd like to get a little bit more insight on. Questions that I really, wanted to address, somewhat more discussed in your verbal presentation. What is the purpose of this measurement technology? That was the main thing that I really didn't get from the report. I came in on this thinking, wow, we're going to have a discussion of multidimensional poverty because, heck, ESCO has got this beautiful report and everything that I'm familiar with, and multidimensional, and it's going to, but it went another way, and that was quite interesting. The question is whether it's fit for purpose. I think that's always what is the purpose of it? Is it fit for that purpose? Is it well explained in this document? Is it well justified? Are there other options that haven't been considered? And overall, do I have any suggestions for improving the report? Now, I'm going to try and address some of those. As I said, I began at the beginning saying that multidimensional was my thought. In particular, that's a concern of SDG goal number 1.2, poverty in all of its dimensions using national definitions and so on. But it became clear that the focus was almost exclusively on monetary policy, at least the parts I focused on, which suggested the goal, for instance, 1.1 on monetary poverty was what we were really trying to get into here. Of course, that goal is narrowly focused on extreme income or monetary poverty expenditure or whatever, as defined by the World Bank's very successful, long-standing definition. So addressing goal 1 didn't really immediately provide a purpose for the technology, and indeed, the report, interestingly, invoked 1.2 as a kind of justification, if you will, given its national focus. But again, I'm not sure if that's really going to get me going. You invoked a little bit of the Atkinson report as well, but again, that's sort of out there, and it's internal to the World Bank a bit, and so I didn't quite get it. So I was trying to really get a sense of it. Got a little bit more from your discussion, but the writing didn't give it to me. So this led to the question: what's the purpose of this effort and the measure? So I said, okay, this must be an appropriate regional monetary measure for the group of countries that you're focusing on. And that could complement the multidimensional approach, and that'd be really a good thing to the extent that many countries in the region would like to have such a measure to help gauge their progress against the progress of others in the region, potentially, or perhaps even to act as a guide in creating national monetary poverty measures for those that don't really have them. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons one could put down as primary. But that really wasn't what it was. It was extended to well beyond the regional to the global. So it made the purpose a little bit unclear. Again, particularly in light of the discussion, it seemed to pit one global tech at the bank or through bank authors against the tech that you're putting forward in the head-to-head discussion. If a global technology is the purpose, I think that it would be natural to have solid conversations with the monetary poverty experts at the bank. And maybe even lots of national poverty offices. But I didn't get a whole lot of evidence that was what was going on here. So I was sort of left saying, well, how'd this come into effect? Fortunately, you've been telling me a little bit more, so I have a sense a bit more. But I think in the report, particularly in the beginning of the report, it would be really helpful to get a bit more background, a little bit more discussion that involves, I mean, if I were at the bank, I'd probably look at this and say, huh? And so that may be, part of the response that we receive. It just seems natural to me as someone who hangs around the building over there. Yeah. So I really could have misinterpreted the discussion. Maybe the expansion to the global arena is just a way of illustrating the tech. That's what I thought originally it was. Just you're going to illustrate it. Here's my example. But it ain't that. Since, of course, the motivation of the report, at least in one section, was the need for a new global measurement. So, and you said it at the end of this one, of course. Even if the purpose was to look at regional, did I miss something here, or was it really based on that one kind of discussion, study of Egyptian poverty? I mean, was that where you drew a lot of the lessons that led you to think regionally here? And that's one country, and usually at the bank and other places, it's a lot of countries and a lot of analyses that go on to make sure that what's going on is really robust and it's in fact what's happening. So, so I would argue that's kind of a bit of a narrow basis for regional measure, much less a measure that's being suggested for use outside of the region, for goodness sake. Next, given the importance of the measurement technology to the report, I really wasn't impressed with the clarity of the explanation of the technology within the report. One of the standard desiderata for policy-relevant measurement technologies is that it should be understandable and easy to describe. From what I read, I'm not sure if this is the case. I just didn't see what the measure was. Okay. I'd recommend spending some effort making sure the reader is aware of its formal definition as well as its interpretation at an intuitive level. A box might be appropriate. I mean, perhaps the intention was that the reader was supposed to read the technical papers referred to in the report. But given that they're unpublished manuscripts, not in journals, the reader surely would not be expected to have read them already, or even to have read them, to read them in order to get to the main technology in the paper. So, I think the more positive evidence of the approach's clarity and fitness, the better, given the fact that the relevance of the entire report would seem to depend on it. Fourth, it seems to me that there's a fundamental trade-off between anchoring the technology in national benchmarks and comparability across countries in the region. I really wanted to see more as to what's really happening there, because national poverty lines are set for any number of reasons. They're not done beautifully according to the same technology methodology. There's a lot of reasons why they might be high in one country and low in another. So how might one justify a standard that builds off of non-comparable national lines using, quote, a perspective that is closer to national poverty definitions? I mean, apples and oranges, folks. What are the assumptions behind this? Okay, what's the model? What's the coherent conceptual framework that allows us to take that leap? I don't see it, but maybe it's just me. Next, are PPP income levels assumed to be comparable across countries? If not, then can any comparability at all be assured? If so, then surely we have a basis for comparisons to be made. Yes, there may be other living customs and standards, but are you actually planning on providing an analysis of such for each country? Okay. Next, in comparing the SPL and your approach, it's unclear to me why you would you could equally well reverse the argument and say that your approach underestimates poverty in high-income countries while overestimating in low-income countries. It depends which approach is assumed to be the correct approach. And that just hit me in the face when I read that part. I said, well, how do you justify that statement? You're giving a conclusion that this is overestimation and underestimation. But yeah, it depends on what your basis of fact is, what your basis that you're starting with is. I know that you support this technology, but others support the other technology. Seventh, I'm not clear about the next one, not clear about the concavity discussion. Maybe it was in one of the papers that led up to this. By the way, it's strict concavity because the linear thing would be contained, therefore you wouldn't be criticizing it if, right? So do put in strict if you mean strict. It requires poverty lines to increase at a decreasing rate in incomes. Is this justified at the household level and then applied at the country level for country average income? If so, does that really make sense? And how is it justified when you can have inequality and all sorts of things happening in the income distribution? So, since the entire report is absolute versus relative versus hybrid poverty standards, it would seem to make sense to have noted the alternative or an alternative approach presented in the paper, Absolute versus Relative Poverty, in the May 1998 AER. It imagines a hybrid standard that's a weighted geometric average of common absolute poverty line, the baseline. It didn't talk about the base at the bottom, but that was natural to put in there, like at the bank and so on. But a common absolute poverty line and a country's relative poverty line, where the power on the relative term is the region-wide elasticity of the hybrid line with respect to the income standard that's underlying the relative poverty measure. Okay? And it's therefore less than 1, therefore concave. Okay? The elasticity in that situation is defined as a normative parameter which states by how much should the poor share in the growth in the income standard. So An absolute line says they shouldn't share a thing. You have 0 as the elasticity. A relative line says they should share 1-to-1. A hybrid line, based on the kind of general data that was found in the 1995 Measuring Poverty book and a number of other places, has it somewhere around a third or something. Whatever. It's less than 1. And it's out there. And that is an alternative approach that is sort of keeping a normative basis in a sense, where actually then taking this region coherent standard, it would be comparable across all countries, but then countries could actually choose their own elasticity. Because it is a normative choice. And it's the other normative choice, in addition to their poverty line. How that's going to change through time. US, 0. Other countries, 1 in Europe. More rational, in between. But how in between? And how do you explain it to policymakers? I think an elasticity is quite simple. People get it, the 100%, the percentage versus percentage. Okay. So that's an alternative. I don't know, I didn't see it discussed in the paper, but it might be something to look at. And the author is a very good friend of mine. Okay. It's me. Finally, the concept of poverty standard really matters. Is it normative? Is it scientific? What is the role of nations in setting poverty lines in national, regional, and global level? You just said an objective was to support our countries. Would it make better sense to focus on the individual countries that here start with your absolute as a base, here's the change, and how you're going to do it through time? This is one way to think it through. Or do you need to have comparisons across countries? I'm sort of in the first camp now. I don't like comparisons this much. They're politically troubling, and they don't really help countries quite as much. If you want to do a regional for a regional because the region wants to do a regional, I'm for it. They can get together and decide what the parameters are going to be. But I don't think statistical can give you all that stuff. I just don't think so. People who try to find essentially normative concepts statistically, I don't know whether they really succeed. But anyway, that's a couple of more really small comments. The first order dominance curve that you have there, of course, is Foster and Shorrock's. That's classical 1988 paper describing poverty dominance. But the thing that you're not saying is that you're changing the poverty line in each years. So the poverty line that you're actually comparison is not the same one for each 2 years. It's over here in one and over here in the other. So that's why that first order dominance doesn't necessarily hold once you take into account the transformations you're doing with your cut. The other thing was the welfare gap of the bank. It's new, so maybe you didn't mention it, but it seems like the welfare gap of the bank that's being adopted is the shared prosperity measure. Global cutoff. That's where we want people to get to, right? It seems similar. I'd really like to know the comparison between what you're doing and what they're doing, if you could kind of get to it. And finally, the inequality-adjusted discussion you had there. Was that just the SEN measure of welfare, where you take the Gini, 1 minus the Gini times the mean?
It's the...
or did you Atkinson?
It's the Atkinson. No, it was the Atkinson. Then we changed it to the ESQA.
Gini. Okay, so it is SEN. Okay, so the correlation between SEN and anything poverty kind of makes sense. Particularly if that poverty has a hybrid or relative and absolute. So look at that carefully and you'll see probably why that might occur. Yeah. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for listening to my...
Thank you so much, Professor James. This is really eye-opening, I would say. Yes. Thanks for being frank and...
and it could let me be honest about it, is that it could just be me. But I told you what came out of reading through it a couple of times and then writing down my notes to myself with lots of questions.
No, this is very helpful indeed. But I don't think we'll go through a discussion. We'll move on to the next.
Please.
Yes, and then we can maybe have a discussion afterwards on responding to some of these issues. Salim?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to congratulate ESCWA for undertaking this report, World Poverty Higher Than We Thought. I think it's an important contribution to the discourse on poverty and vulnerability. And actually, the ESCWA work on poverty and vulnerability advanced some approaches, in the conceptualization of poverty lines and poverty measures, and projecting the poverty trends under different scenarios of equality and distribution and also growth, and finally policy discussion. But I also think that this particular report needs to be contextualized in the spectrum of work that ESCWA has taken on poverty and vulnerability. Even though this particular report stands as a standalone report, but its predecessor, if I may say it, the World Development Challenges report, I mean, if you don't read them together, actually you get partial views of things. The World Development Challenge also has come up with the Development Challenges Index, DCI, which is Quality Adjusted Human Development Index, as well as bringing in other dimensions of human development in the discussion of broader notions of human development. So together they can give you a better story rather than looking at this particular report, I think. And ESCWA has also developed this money-metric poverty assessment tool. I think you call it IMPACT.
IMPACT.
Yeah.
We'll be presenting it.
Exactly, which facilitates poverty measurements worldwide under different growth and income distribution scenarios. I think those are good contributions. Having said that, let me concentrate on three questions. One question is that, does the report add value to the post-2030 global poverty reduction agenda? Number one. Number two, if you want to move forward, what are the areas where you need to work more or concentrate or add? And number three, how ESCWA as an organization can capitalize on this particular report. I think if we go back to that question, whether the report adds value to the post-2030 global poverty reduction agenda, there are a couple of reasons why it can actually add to that discussion, that discourse. One is that, in a way, it raises awareness about the scale of the problem, the poverty trends under different scenarios. So it also can fill the gap in the SDG 1 monitoring. That's something that the report can do. Second, we are talking about forecasting poverty rates under different drivers of poverty, mainly growth and inequality. It helps countries, actually, the policymakers, to identify policy options relevant to different scenarios. And that may be something which would be a value added to this report if it is discussed at the country level with the policymakers. And third, it informs regional, global, South-South dialogue on poverty reduction. And in a way, it also helps countries to exchange experiences with regard to poverty policies, with regard to what worked, and also with regard to what did not work. And in a way, this can provide a platform where this kind of discussions can happen. I think the notion of impact is a value added because it actually facilitates the poverty monitoring under different scenarios. You talked about the poverty narrative. broadened by examining three issues there: the extreme poverty lines, vulnerability, and destitution. And that also has helped a lot of the readers and the policymakers to look at some of these specific things. I would also like to emphasize the next point is that DCI, that's a powerful measure actually, and I think to build on that would be something that would be quite useful. I like the idea of categorization of countries, so that when we talk about the policies, it's not that one kind of policy fits everybody equally. Rather, we have taken the 4 kinds of animals and then see what can be done about those. I think those are some of the positive and value added of the report. Moving forward, I mean, you talked about rethinking poverty. I think the rethinking can start on the measure or the poverty line that you have suggested. I'm not absolutely sure whether I understood it very well, that you're trying to take the national poverty lines anchored into the cost of basic needs and the ratio of average income, but making it internationally comparable. So I'm not absolutely sure how that thing would go. I mean, just to looking at these 3 dimensions, I have a problem synthesizing them. And then you try to compare it with the World Bank's societal poverty line and everything. A simple question sometimes may be asked that if you are talking about the cost of basic needs, what happens if the bundle of basic needs change, or the price of that bundle changes? Then that would change your poverty line. So one is that how you actually align international comparison with national poverty lines. And second, in that ratio, how do you deal with the cost of the basic needs issue? I think this is something you can rethink as you move forward. There are certain missed groups that you have talked about where you can broaden the narrative. Older people, people with disabilities, women you have mentioned, and other groups. Maybe further work can be done on some of those groups so that you actually enrich the discussion that you already had on extreme poverty, destitution, and other ideas. The institutional discussion, I think, could be strengthened. I mean, sometimes we put the whole question of the institution under the umbrella of governance, but I think we have to debundle that, because governance is a kind of an umbrella notion. But when we talk about the institution in terms of the efficiency, the decision taking at the country level, the whole question of the political economy of it, particularly with regard to poverty. I mean, it's not a technical issue, it's very much a political and political economy issue. So how that can be done, not only in this specific region where ESCWA is, but in other regions also. That institutional discussion could enrich that. Some of them have come out in the World Development Challenge report, but I think we can incorporate those discussions here. Even though there are lots of reference to the multidimensionality of poverty, but in my mind, I don't think you have done enough justice to that in this report. I mean, there are references to multidimensionality of poverty here and there, but you come back again and again to the moneymetric poverty. And that multidimensionality, the importance that it deserves in the whole discussion, as a reader of the report, I didn't see it. So maybe this is something you can think through again. When I talk to the policymakers at the country level, particularly in developing countries, one of the things that is coming up very strongly in the discussion of poverty is the whole question of the opportunity deficit or the poverty of opportunities. Employment for younger people, opportunities in education, in health services, employment, and so on and so forth. So the whole question of the opportunity deficit as a concept related to inequality or absolute poverty, or the poverty of opportunities, may be something that you can think of, because that is something the policymakers in developing countries would be looking for as they move forward the policies on poverty reduction there. How ESCWA can capitalize it on this particular report? I think 3 ways. One is that build on the work of others who are doing in some of the issues that you are dealing in the report. Particularly, I mentioned the issue of conflict. There are references, there are discussions on the own question of conflict and poverty. I think very recently the OFI report, the latest one, was on conflict on poverty. And there are very good discussions, measurements of MPI in those countries, 69 if I'm not mistaken. Maybe that can be built into your discussion, and you can capitalize on the ongoing work. This is just an example. There may be other examples also. Second, there are other regional commissions who are known for work on poverty and inequality. ECLAC. I mean, that comes to everybody's mind, and they have a legacy of work in this respect. So maybe we can bring those work into the work that ESCWA is doing. ESCAP has also started doing some of the work in these areas. Not that much, but we can bring that in. Finally, the report has a technical aspect, and we can discuss it at length, but we also want to have it owned and used by the policymakers at the country level. I mean, as we always say that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and actually the test of the report is in the use of it by countries in setting their strategies. So I think you can use this report to have dialogues with various stakeholders at the country level, not only the government, the civil society, the academics and others. And that kind of ownership is very much important for a report of this kind. And finally, you have 2 reports before you, the World Development Challenges report and then this World Poverty report that you have here. Is there any way of synthesizing them? Because that would make a great report actually. But that's just a proposal for ESCWA. You can think through it. Thank you.
Thanks, Salim. I think we have about maybe 15 minutes before the break, so we can have an open discussion. But let me thank you again, Professor James and Salim, for these very insightful comments. And again, we expected nothing less but to have these very useful critical remarks. I'm not going to try to respond to the technicalities. Maybe we'll have exchanges on some of the issues. But let me again go back to the key insights here. And I think you pointed out to one of the major issues. Countries, if you're going to anchor with national poverty lines, well, national poverty lines are very different from countries measuring national poverty lines for different reasons. Well, as it turns out, actually, a lot of the NPLs that you see on that graph are being done by the bank. So actually, there's a lot of consistency between them. I mean, so methodologically, most of them are what the bank would define as a lower poverty line. And that's why I mentioned that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, yeah, sure, some countries would overestimate, Mexico, China would underestimate for different reasons. But the key insight is that on average,
they tend to get things right, and the key is on average. Okay, so the overestimations and the underestimations, assuming there's no bias, which is a big assumption, then you would tend to get the average would get things right. So, in other words, if you're sitting on a, let's say, the 50th percentile of the world income level, and you've got 10 countries doing their national poverty line assessments, the average for that percentile would probably make more sense for that group of countries, and hence the basis for our regression. The other thing that comes out of the empirical evidence is that it is intuitive, actually, that if you're a poorer country, then the relationship between your cost of basic needs and average income is going to be quite high, right? I mean, you're going to be, looking at even 40% of the median is not going to be enough, and that's why you have a problem with the SPL, because when you actually look at the way countries measure their poverty at that level, you need something about closer to 65, 70 to capture the relationship. But if you move to the other end of the spectrum, go to Qatar, 10% could be way too much. Our methodology captures that. And so going back to your main point is that does Qatar have 30% poverty if you use the SPL? No, I don't think so. My pre-analytics would tell me that Qatar has 0% poverty. And our approach solves that problem. I think it does. It solves that conceptually, it solves empirically, and I think we have a good, robust empirical and theoretical basis. And as I said, go back to basics. In fact, the title of our background paper is, back to basics, back to Engels. So I think that needs a little bit more of a bilateral discussion we can take forward. But my key point is that if you are a rich country and you're using something like 40% of your median as a measure of poverty, then that is way too high, or 50% in the case of ESP. It shouldn't be. It has to be way less. How much less? Well, this is one way of solving that problem. Is it the only way? No. Is it the best way? I don't know. But it's I think, the best that we can offer at this stage. And if you get that insight right, that key insight, if you believe in that, then everything else follows. All of the other results, the vulnerability, the extreme, because they're all anchored in that relationship. And that's why this paper is very important, back to the basics. So that's my first comment, I think, and it's an important one, because it's really a foundational one. The link with multidimensional poverty, I fully agree. I feel guilty, after all of the work, and Sabina being here, after all of the work we've done on multidimensional poverty, now we're going back to money metrics. But this is a region that is, when you look at the data, I mean, we are the only region worldwide where this is becoming a huge issue. I mean, we're talking destitution rising 4 or 5 times. It's the only region in the world where we see this money metric poverty is becoming a huge challenge. We can't just stay still. We have to, answer basic questions like, well, how do we measure this thing across countries? Is there a we don't have national poverty. I mean, it's very challenging. So that's why we're doing this. And the best way to address these issues is when you bring in, because you don't have enough data on the ground, you don't have surveys, is to bring in the cross-country comparisons. It allows you a more robust way of informing countries that actually this should be your appropriate measure. So when we go to a country like Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, they don't publish their national poverty lines. They publish their survey results, though, which takes us back to the PPPs and comparisons across countries, and I agree. It's a can of worms, but that's another issue. But if we tell Saudi Arabia that, you're at the same level of Spain, income-wise, or, OECD countries, the absolute poverty measures you have for these countries would probably put them around 25% of your median income. So you should be in that border. If you use that, then we're talking about this much, more or less, poverty. Now, the interesting thing is that when you look at the very few absolute poverty studies that were done in the Gulf, they resonate with our findings. So they're the same order of magnitude. They're not published, but we know that. And when we do the comparisons between what we find using the ESCO poverty lines and between the studies that were done at the national level, there is a lot of comparability. So that's taking me back to the whole purpose of the exercise. It's really in order for us, yes, to, as I said, do two things. Go back to the regional narrative, but armed with this global, robust methodology, and to also contribute to a global narrative that needs to be contributed to from our perspective, from the perspective of the South. And that's, again, one of the things that we should do. So the problem is that you have this uncomfortable juxtaposition between money metrics and multidimensional, which I admit needs more work. And I was talking to Sabina about this. We're working on that. And what I tried to do is to build up to an argument, basically, that, if you really want to get to the heart of money metrics, then you need to address the governance, health, education issues. And that's where we bring in the world development challenges. More work needs to be done on clarifying the assumptions. I fully agree with you, especially that these technical papers are unpublished in journals. They're there on our website, but we need to do more work in justifying why it is that we're doing what we're doing. We think we have good reasons, but it's not clear in this draft. So very well taken, and it will be taken into account. More work needs to be done on linking with multidimensional poverty and with the DCI. So these are very helpful comments. Thank you very much. I think we have maybe 10 minutes for open discussion. Sabina, and then
I'll be brief because I can't wait to hear the others. No, I really would like it, and I always try to think, okay, what's the purpose? What would this change? And so option one is that you're trying to change $2.15 and the other money metric poverty measures. Option two is that you're trying to say where are the countries we should focus in this time. And option three is you're trying to do something for post-2030. Say what would be the money metric ones going into that. And I think depending how you see, and a report will naturally have multiple agendas, but if it's really focusing on changing the current extreme monetary poverty and suite of measures, then I think having more systematic comparisons, like is your finding about the Arab region also finding when you use the $2.15 a day and that suite of measures, so that you can figure out, is it only from you? So what's the value added? So making it really clear, if that's really the fundamental agenda, it'd be good to just know which of those are distinctive of yours and which are corroborated by others. The second is if you're focused, and I really liked, focusing on the countries that had gotten down to within 3 percentage points or 4 to 10 or whatever, and putting the population shares, of course, that was very good. About the 32 countries with 10 percentage points or more, or 10% of the population that have 20 percentage points variation, it'd be nice to know a little bit about them. Are they countries of conflict? What are regions? But for the ones that have gotten it, of course, some countries have vanishingly small measures of extreme poverty, so 3 percentage points is quite a lot. And so you're doing absolute, which I agree with at one level, but wondering also to what extent those 3%, the ones that are the wins, the 38% of the population in those countries, just, I think, probing that a little bit more, really the value added is these are the countries you need to look at. Okay, how many of these are high income? How many of these are... But I think that finding could be one that people could say, okay, where do we focus on? How is this different from the extreme monetary poverty countries we're supposed to focus on? And what do we learn about it? That could be one takeaway. And the third, I think, would be 2015. I think for both 1 and 3, I had a question about Gini, which is very predictable. I didn't hear James say it, which was a surprise. But the bank now does have, for some countries, disaggregations by rural and urban, disaggregations by age, whatever. And Gini, you can't disaggregate Atkinson, you can. So I wondered about, softening that to get to a disaggregation inequality measure, so that you could, if it's basically being put out there to replace $2.15 in that suite, then how will disaggregation work with the structure that it is now? So that was a question. And yeah, I think those are my main ones. But
So your question is basically, the bank only has, I think, the rural urban for a few countries.
Yeah, but they're trying to do more, and it has age for a bunch of countries.
That would be great.
And it's got gender, whatever that is, which I don't really agree with, but at least it has that segregation, which you can't do with a genie.
Yes, that's a good point.
So I confess that my brief for today was focusing on chapters 6 and 7, so that's what I read. So I have 3 questions, which are probably just out of ignorance for not having read the first chapters of the report. But one is, on the basis of your presentation, I just missed what the key difference was. This is just, I missed it, I'm sure you said it. What the key difference was between what you're proposing and the societal poverty line, because the spirit seems very similar. And so that's my main question. And then the other 2 were, one is I worked at some point on the definition of this line separating the middle class from what we call the vulnerable.
Yes.
And the Latin America case, more than a decade ago, you have a similar line between the vulnerable and the non-poor, and I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how that line was chosen.
Yes, sure.
And then the third point is on relating on the comments that you received from both James and Selim about better integrating the multidimensional and the monetary. Just to mention, of course, at the bank, I was there when we were trying to do this, and I think James and Sabine are not particularly happy with it, but our way of integrating it was to have monetary as one of the dimensions, which then meant that the other 2 dimensions were added to it, and you had that. Now, there are arguments that we can have here around the table about, functioning and so on and so forth, but that provided to us a very natural way of doing it. And in fact, just to say, the nice thing about that is that you had the bank's traditional $2.15 or $1 a day, whatever it was, the extreme. And then the societal poverty line builds on it in one way, right? So anchored on it, and then takes the societal. And then the multidimensional built on it in another way, which was to anchor these 2 other dimensions. That's what we were trying to do anyway. So just as a thought as well.
Great 3 points. Can I just respond quickly before we go to Hazel? I don't particularly like including income in the MPI, but that's a position in ESCO MPIs we have done it before in Palestine, for example, but that's a discussion that happens at the national level. It's an inevitable question, and we usually leave these to the countries to decide on. But I would like to separate, given the very inherently different kinds of policies you want to embark on in order to resolve both. But I can see very much the overlap diagram that I showed wouldn't be possible if you had the income poverty as part of the MPI. But again,
it is possible, and in fact we had those diagrams because it depends on how many dimensions.
Yeah, you can have it as a contribution.
Yeah.
But what I mean to say is that the income poor using one definition, the MPI using another, and then you have the overlap. That would not be possible. But to have a contribution of income poverty as one of the dimensions, yes, of course, you can have that. There are arguments for and against. My personal leaning is a bit to separate, but there are others even within the institution. I think Rola might lean the other. It's a debatable issue. So, and it's really how you see the value added for the exercise. The vulnerability line is based on 9 country study analyses. So you have the lower poverty line, which is the national poverty line. Then for these countries, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, we did Oman as well, 2015 middle class report, so you can refer back to that. We also had Yemen, we had another LDC, I'm not sure I can remember, maybe Sudan, yes, we had Sudan. So in these countries, we looked at the gap between the lower poverty line and the upper poverty line. Okay, and then so that basically gave us the poor but not extremely poor. But then we have an interesting concept to define the economic middle class, which is basically the families who are spending on non-essential goods, the equivalent of the household-specific
poverty line for that household. So if you're spending on non-essentials, the equivalent of what is deemed to be a household-specific poverty line, then you're no longer part of the middle class, and then you can isolate the non-middle class as a residual. That leaves you with the middle class. It was a very novel, I think, concept, but that's how we use it. And then the relationships, the multipliers from the NPLs were used to determine the vulnerability lines. So that's how we did it. And typically it's about 50% above the national poverty line. That's the typical vulnerability line. So that's the
line where the vulnerable begins or where they end?
No, the vulnerable ends. So that's the question. The societal poverty line, as I said, it's we're very similar, except for the linearity assumption. We just don't have the linearity assumption. It's a non-linear. That's it.
You just have the only difference is
exactly.
you have this log on log.
Exactly. It's just that. That's it. That's it. We don't believe in having a fixed median. It's not why 50%, why 40%. No, it depends on where you are above the 215. Okay, so that's the key insight here, and it makes a huge difference, by the way.
And fitting it on national poverty lines. Yeah. So that's kind of using national poverty lines.
That's societal poverty line was fitted on national poverty line.
Sorry?
They also societal poverty line was fitted on national poverty lines.
Yes.
6.5.
Yes.
Okay.
You will get.
We let the parameter be determined by national.
So the difference is that instead of a linear thing, you've got this.
That's
log.
it, and that's a big difference. We think.
I mean, yeah. Okay.
So, Hazel, you want
you might want to,
comment.
I think given the times where you might want to pick up on this in the discussion later on, because I know there's going to be more discussion about the policy implications and so on, but I was really interested in the presentation about the kind of the 4 groups and the relationship to the kind of poverty targets. And I'm sorry if I missed this, but I wasn't sure what the relationship was between the groupings and sort of national income and sort of where they are on the kind of development scale, because I think one of your comments was about how that then relates to the sort of growth versus distribution implications and the policy implications for progressive taxes. I think if they broadly relate to kind of income groups, then it would kind of fit quite well with our understanding of the evidence around the impact of say taxation and social spending on redistribution, because in lower income countries there's much less capacity to redistribute through those systems because they have very narrow tax bases.
Exactly.
And also obviously less capacity in terms of the amount that they can spend on social services. So I was wondering about that in terms of the what you were saying about groups 2 and 3, I think obviously needing to work more on the kind of redistribution and particularly there being room for direct taxation. So I wasn't sure what you meant by that, because in some countries there might be room in the sense that they have kind of lower shares of direct taxation compared to other types of taxation, but whether they can actually collect that or not is a different story. And also when you look at the impact of fiscal policy on inequality and poverty, you need to look at the whole system together, so not just progressive taxation, but how much you're actually raising to spend on more equitable policies as well. So we found that the biggest impacts you can have on inequality, for example, is not just direct taxation, but also direct transfers in the form of spending on education and health and so on. And in a lot of countries, especially the lower income countries that, as we've agreed, have lower capacity to kind of raise revenue through progressive direct taxation, it can make sense to focus more on things like VAT, which are easier to collect, in order to kind of raise more revenue that you can then spend more equitably. So I was just sort of questioning your broad conclusions about direct taxation, but I think we can probably discuss that more.
That's a very big issue. But I mean, just very briefly, I think these are the kinds of discussions you cannot have at the global level. It has to be at the national level. Mm-hmm. But in general, when you look at the groups, they are more or less Group 4 is the low-income countries, lower middle are in Group 3, and so forth. Yeah, but there are. It's not 100%. You can see that in some of the high income countries are in Group
Group 2 or even Group 3 and so forth. So I agree with you that the issue of taxation has a lot to do with absorptive capacity, has to do with the institutional ability to collect. It's easier to get money from VATs and then distribute them efficiently and effectively, but that's the whole issue. Can you do the targeting properly? Very often that's not the case. I mean, in the case of Egypt, for example, it's you can get more money, but and the targeting to reach the poor is very difficult. It's you don't have the ability to reach out to the poor and target them efficiently because of many reasons. Now, this point that we're saying is that given the amount of wealth you have in countries like Egypt, Middle Eastern countries, it would take a minuscule amount of wealth contributions in order for you to address the whole gamut of poverty, vulnerability issues. But again, we can come back and say, but isn't that assuming that the state can collect? And I fully agree. This is a political economy discussion, and there's no doubt that you cannot do this as a technical, back of the envelope exercise. It has to do with institutional capacities.
You raised the point from from political perspective, and you both raised the point which I'm advocate of, but I need to see your insights on it. The first one is the comparability.
Yes, crucial.
Okay.
You can't convince people it's comparable. They're going to just throw it out the door.
Okay.
Sorry, this is comparability of poverty lines.
Yeah. But it is the notion. How do you to have comparability? That's the important thing. Is that similar to somebody is measuring GDPs, somebody is measuring unemployment, different countries do their unemployment differently, their GDPs are different. Okay, but at the end of the day we compare.
We do?
At the end of the day we do compare.
With caps.
Yeah, at the end of the day, whatever it is.
We have a conceptual measuring rod, and this measuring rod is there, even though it's measured specifically differently in different places. The extent to which it goes varying across countries or situations, you have a sense of. I mean, you literally do. Go ahead.
No. So on the across national poverty lines, the take that I think Atkinson and Bourguignon had on the original weekly relative line, and Ravallion and Chen, and then which we adopted at the bank with Dean Jolliffe and so on, is very much what you said, which is, well, there are two sources of differences, right? One is prices, and you hope to God that the PPPs do that.
Yeah.
They do it imperfectly, but I don't know of a better.
Sanjay is here, so he'll tell us.
He'll tell us all the goodies.
Now, the other thing then is to say, look, then the lines aren't measuring the same thing, but the conditional average is informative. It's precisely the way you. So the idea is this: that if there is a relative component to well-being, then in the well-being space, right? The line. So in the well-being space, the line is constant. For the line to be constant in the well-being space, it has to rise in incomes if there is a relative component. That was the original motivation for that rising. Well, how do we? You could do that in any number of ways. To be informed by what the countries themselves choose, we plotted on that space, and the idea is, yes, this line over here and this line over here are not comparable, but the slope, some relationship, whether concave or not, right, will tell you what the conditional average is informative. I'm okay with that. I don't know if you want. That is.
No,
yeah.
And that's the key insight. That is the key insight. And as I said, you yourself mentioned that in the papers before that. So we should refer back to that paper, absolutely. So there's nothing dramatically new about it. It's just that, but it makes a difference.
But I have to say that part of the problem with the Valiant approach was that it was. I thought it was hard to capture intuitively what was really going on and what the line turned out to be. It just seemed a little bit clunky in that respect, whereas I always go for the simple thing, which has a parameter that you can explain to someone that then they turn around and say, oh, I get that, yes, here's the share that they should, that they should get as growth occurs. Right.
The elasticity. I agree. It's an elasticity. It's much easier to explain.
And I know that it has simplifications that are, you have some, it doesn't fit perfectly with some of the assumptions that Martin claimed, but then I argued with him about those assumptions anyway. And if you look back at some of the source stuff he was invoking, it actually pointed in another direction, in my direction. So I think that there's some leeway on viewing things this way. And maybe what you're doing is already doing the elasticity stuff. If you think about it, it's elasticity.
It is elasticity. That's the point. That's exactly what we're doing.
And what it is the elasticity.
It doesn't come through because we didn't want it to be technical. I have my marching orders.
Yes.
but it's a point well taken.
And the nice thing about what you're doing, like with what and Axon did and Martin and so on, and we adopted, is that, which elasticity, right? Why not one? I mean, one has a real plausible argument, which is we should require the minimum standard of points. It's not what the Purgat, right? Purgat is to do with the distribution of growth, is what we require the minimum standard to rise. Right? So we require the minimum standard to rise, given that overall standards are rising. One.
Right, except when they fall, and then it looks stupid.
Yeah, but then 0.7, I don't know that it makes a difference.
0.6, it sure can. We really at 0.3 in the.
Why only 0.3 when it's rising then? Why only 0.3? So the argument, you could argue forever about this. The advantage of what you're doing and what they did is let the country data tell you what that elasticity is.
Exactly. Yes, I know.
Exactly. And that I would buy. But I agree with James that you should present it in that way.
And it does beg the question, because you with your nice technical whatever turn around and give this elasticity or whatever, and then who owns that? Is it the country or not? And there's too much over history in poverty analysis of the country being presented with de facto definitions that it really can't get buy-in from its people, and so it just says, okay, we'll put up with it to borrow some money and go on. You don't want that. You want them to be engaged in it. You want them to buy it, to own it, and then by giving an epsilon one way or the other of this elasticity, that they can conceive what it is that they're trying to think of and then actually come to some decision, it could have that effect. I've seen it. The weights and all the other stuff in the MPI
I
certainly have had that
I
effect.
absolutely agree with you, but first you have to do your homework.
Hey.
This discussion needs to proceed, and then we need to make sure that we have
That's what it can't drive. Is that and it almost always stops when it comes to these analyses with the initial discussion. It almost always stops with the statistical analysis. And in fact, it was my assumption that happens. Because, for instance, Martin would say, yes, that's how it should happen. We look at these averages of the poverty lines of these countries, and that's what our $1 a day is. Well, not really. What it was is that you could see $1 a day on that first order dominance graph. And you could see, well, a little to the left and a little to the right. It didn't make much difference. And therefore, it's robust. So however you frame it, marketing-wise, it really is the robustness of the result that is carrying it. And once you view it that way, then it really fits. But I just don't think that the statistical approach is part of the information structure to inform a normative decision. Boom.
That's a good point.
And that's said from start to finish. Atkinson a little less, but even so, Atkinson. Deaton for sure. I mean,
these are
big dudes. So I mean, and let's go back to Measuring Poverty, 1995. The book studying the U.S. situation didn't change a thing, except for some sort of experimental, poverty line came out of it. But it had this large discussion, which led to my paper, large discussion on how the poverty line should change as time goes on and as the standard of living changes. And remember, it can be any standard of living. It could be median, it could be mean, it could be the geometric mean, it could be whatever you, okay. Standard of, this income standard is my construct for an indicator that summarizes the distribution in one income level. And it can be any of them, depending on what it is that you think is important, typically, however, mean or median. Yeah. But once you have all that construct, it becomes really clear what's going on in life. Anyway, that's what I'm going in circles, forgive me. I like this discussion. It's very interesting. But I haven't thought about it for a while.
It's absolutely necessary in our region because...
yeah, the differences, I get it. Yeah. But, actually...
What are we left with when you think of it?
Well...
We don't have many...
But here's the question. Are you going to take... And this is a big question. You use your poverty line, you get this varying, huge poverty line, and you say to yourself, the head count ratio of these things, how comparable are these really? And what do you really mean by this? And what is the line that you get, and what does it really mean? And when you come down to those fundamental questions, that's where you have to have answers. And those answers have to be deep, they have to be in the construction, and you've already presented a way of thinking about it that people buy into, and then when you get it, then they say, okay, I agree. So I think that the presentation is crucial for getting people to accept what the heck you're trying to say. And in case you don't know it, when I write a paper, I spend a couple years getting that presentation correct. Sometimes 10 years. And the answer is it shows, because then people read the paper. They understand it. It's technical, but it's not too technical. That's the point, is that you have to write concisely so that a person at a high level gets it, a person at a low level understands that it could be gotten. They don't have to be the one looking at the box. But they know that box is there. They really want to get into it. It's sort of like showing your hand to people. So then they believe you. The authenticity comes through. So I think the bank does do a great job at that in a lot of their presentations.
Because they spend a lot of time and effort on it.
And money. I don't know how much they're going to spend in the future because, the whole deck, thing has been diminished in terms of power and everything else. They're all in a different building. Who knows what's going to happen in the chief economist.
But no, I'm not familiar with the internal politics that are going on at the bank.
Crazy stuff.
But their reports are really...
Oh, they're first rate, I know.
Great to read,
And plus, when I've worked on them, I know exactly the structure of how they do it. It's like clockwork. They have the first consultant come in, painted all the parts, and it's all organized in ways that I would never have thought to write a paper that way. They do it. All main points, and then the bottom stuff is just to support those points. The points are all important. They always keep to the bottom lines every time. Yeah, it makes it a little trivial to an academic, but it makes it really clearer to the policy and DC consumption world, I would say.
We have a policy of having policy briefs with
policy briefs are great, no question.
That's what we do.
And Sabina does that obviously, and a lot of different think tanks and other folks do that. It's very helpful. But it is true that you don't want to get too technical. But part of what I was saying was cautioning that you want to make sure that people who aren't technical know the technicality is there for the other guy in the office.
Yeah. So your advice is to throw in more boxes.
Not for the purpose of being technical per se, but for the purpose of clarity and transparency of your technology and showing that if you have very fundamental basic ideas from economics, you're going to fully understand it. It isn't just that you're going to have it told to you that this is what it is. You're going to look at it, it's going to be understandable, boom. And that's what I mean. If you look at the hybrid thing in that paper that I've written, or you look at the fundamental form, you go, oh, yeah, I see that. And oh, if you move this by this, then of course that's going to change this by this percentage. Ah, I get it. Now you have to do some little calculus. Sorry, but the ones who know calculus, they get in 3 seconds, and they're already on your page with you now. So I think that would be helpful to people that are, like my level might be here, but people even here are going to get a lot. People here are going to get a lot. You want to have multi-layers within the document to address the different audiences.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And there's been quite a lot of questions about the difference between your approach and the sort of existing standard approaches of the World Bank and others. So if that's people's frame of reference and that's their sort of benchmark, then it could be useful to make it much clearer in terms of how they relate and what the differences are.
And everything that the MPI's definition that they could eventually get really easily. You have a matrix, average the matrix. I mean, you can actually conceive of that in like 3 seconds. Given that they knew that, and given that they understood that data were out there and available, that people actually could get, download, and use and construct the measure, and all the rules were out there as well, it empowered little researchers and stakeholders to play around.
Yeah, because you choose whatever dimension you want, you choose whatever weights you want, you choose whatever.
He really liked the maps, by the way. We presented it, so he's a big fan of the maps.
Yeah.
Because it's easy and you construct it less time.
Yeah.
You just put it and choose whatever you want, and then you can see the impact if you want to change any of the assumption, any of the weights.
That's right.
Or the indicator, if I did any policy in a certain part of an indicator, accessibility to health or lower maternal mortality and the health, I can see, does it improve that much? Then I can see where do I put my money. Do I put it in the health or in the education or in assets and services?
That is so interesting because,
it's automatic.
Interestingly enough, multidimensional poverty is probably more focused with budgets than income-based poverty, in the sense that you can actually assign clear policies to do the trick, whereas with income, yes, there are transfers, but what are you really doing with the transfer? You're lowering the current period's poverty level, this period. Okay, then what happens next period? You got to do the same thing to make the same thing happen.
Well, unless you can do something with that money that is sustainable in some way, more permanent. Yeah.
So there is the investment, and the investment typically doesn't go into just transfer per se. It goes into transfer plus.
Although there are some examples of cash transfers, like lump sum transfers that are being used that are actually showing that there are people that don't need to kind of remain on them if they're able to invest in things that will help them.
Yeah,
I always thought also when I was, when they're telling me about the MPIs, and I said, and then there's income, and I said, that put income is one dimension.
Yeah, we did that in Mexico.
Yeah, okay, so I have 5 dimensions. You can have assets and add one income. And if you want to know money metric, just zero everything. Then you get the money metric.
That's exactly what it means. That's what money metric does.
I always tell them, no, it could be part, and if I want to measure money metric, I zero all of my dimensions.
And the implicit.
And this becomes.
And I love it because it really makes it explicit that if you only measure money metric, you are explicitly zeroing the other dimensions. And that's an important statement as well because.
That's what I wanted to say. When they say interaction, that's I keep telling my team. I don't know the statistics. We'll go back but logically, just put it as a dimension.
Can do.
And then I can see, okay, if I improve poverty, because at the end of the day, to me, multidimensional poverty MPI is more important because it is the quality of life.
I think you're right.
As a policy maker, it's my quality of life. And so, yes, I need to have income, but I need to have better services, better accessibility to other infrastructures, all of this. What's the use of having the money and I don't have a good education or good health or good, there's no. So I keep saying, put it there, And then I will go and say, is it so much important for me to reduce the poverty or to improve health? Or education, or opportunity on labor market, or assets, or services. So it just becomes part, that money matter becomes part, because then I can measure. If I reduce this poverty, I will see what my MPI becomes. If it is so much impactful, I can see it. If it's not that much impactful, I can see, okay, I will have this X amount of dollars in my fiscal space. Do I do it here or there or that? And this becomes, and I keep saying, put that dimension, poverty, and put whatever line.
You know, you saw that there was this intersection going on. Income and then MPI, you can see it as kind of a unioning at the end of the day. Did I say a union? I'm probably being intersection. I can't remember yet. My brain is kind of weird here. But that is a potential. At the end of the day, you can play a little bit of that game where you actually conceptually separate them, but then at the end of the day, you can also have them together. Mexico did that. And Mexico actually had a weird thing. You couldn't be poor unless you were income poor. And that was based on the policymakers. We listened to what they said, and that was what they were trying to tell us. And for salience of the measure, you needed to have income be that important. And so it turned out that the intensity was measured on the social dimensions because everyone was income poor. But poverty identification needed income poverty. And so it's a different dynamic than what we have in most of the MPIs. But it's there and it's interesting.
But even if I have that income part of the MPI, I zeroed everything, I get this circle. I have it part of, I will have another circle where I can zero income, and I can have the other circle.
True.
And then I put the income, I will get the intersection.
Yeah, so the question always is the different poor people. That's it. Who's poor under one, who's poor under the other, and who's poor under the third. And they're different people. They're identified as being poor income-wise, they're over here. Identified as being poor without income, it's over here. Identified as being poor under both, it's over here. And so they're different groups. That's what the intersection thinks. Yeah. And the problem is that if you're not careful, you can divert the attention of policymakers by having multiple classes of poor people when the usual excitement of changing things is doing something for the poor. And so there's an argument not to make it so that it's, that this is the income poor, here's the MPI poor, and not make it so that it's confusing. Policymakers get confused easily. And that's one of the ways they can get...
Policy making, especially when it comes to budget, is all about trade-offs as well. So how do you decide which poor is more deserving of the other?
That's why you need the intersection.
Part of the discussion will focus, as I said, more on the growth and inequality dynamics. Some of the results that we get when we zoom in on questions like, which countries have the best growth rates? Is it what about the inequalities and changes over genes? So we're kind of explaining the main results as I presented, and zooming in more on the growth and inequality side. I think Reha will just again dash through the key results on the growth side, and Vlad, you'll take over the inequality. Put together maybe no more than 10 to 15 minutes of just presenting results, and then we open the floor for discussing. So go ahead, Reha.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on this fruitful and very timely discussion. Again, as Khaled said, my presentation will mainly be about the growth part of explaining the poverty like results. How is growth related to poverty? How strong is this relationship? And also, importantly, we discuss how strong is the relationship between macroeconomic growth and growth at the household level, because this is very important for policy-making decisions. So to start with, as this graph shows, there's a clear, strong relationship between growth, economic growth, and when I say economic growth, I mean here income growth at the household level, of course, per capita. And here also, I want to also note that we proxy, so income is used to proxy for expenditure. So countries that use expenditure are included, but we just say growth, income for simplicity. And we see that most countries are situated in quadrant 4, which means that most countries experienced a reduction in poverty rates, which is situated on the y-axis, along with a growth in mean income of households on average. So this is like, it's clear and it is expected that most countries or countries that experience economic growth at the household level have experienced poverty reductions. But we see that this is like to a varying degree. For example, on the extreme right of this graph, we see that China, Uzbekistan, and Belarus are situated on the extreme right and at the lower part, which means that they have like really benefited from economic growth at the household level. On the other hand, Ethiopia did not reach such high household income growth rates. However, it experienced like large or huge poverty reduction over this period between 1995 and 2024, which this will be attributed to the other explanatory variable of poverty, which is inequality, which my colleague Vladimir will elaborate on later on. So also what we can see, of course, is that countries that experienced a reduction in household income had like an increase in poverty rate, which is expected. However, a handful of countries on the other quadrants, which are quadrants 1 and quadrant 3, experienced the opposite or the unexpected trend, which is a reduction in poverty rates with also a reduction in household income, which again raises the importance of inequality and distribution, where, for example, if we look at the quadrant 4, the country, which is MWI, Malawi, experienced a reduction in household income, coupled with a slight reduction in poverty rates. And of course, this is attributed to better distribution in income despite a collapse in income on average. So yeah, next slide, please. If you look at the regional level, it's interesting to look at the best performers over this period between 1995 and 2024. And of course, the steepest rise, which is seen on the orange line, is the East Asia and the Pacific region, which has surpassed many regions over the years. So, for example, it surpassed the Arab region in 2010, if we look at the intersection between the orange line and the green line. And recently, it's also surpassed the Latin American region. But of course, it still is way behind North America in terms of levels. So North America has the highest per capita mean expenditure or mean income at the household level, which is using the axis on the right. And also the graph on the right shows the growth rates, the annualized growth rates. And of course, East Asia and the Pacific shows the most impressive annualized growth rate over this period, which coincides with huge achievements in poverty reduction for the main countries in this region, which affect or they are the main drivers of this poverty reduction and income growth, like China and Indonesia, of course. So yeah, this is mainly about the regions. If you look at the country level, and mainly at the countries that had the highest improvements in income growth or income between 1995 and 2024, on the right, we can see that Lithuania and Belarus, Uzbekistan, and China are the top 4, for example, in terms of improving the household income per capita, where, for example, Lithuania had like a huge increase in mean expenditure or in mean income, sorry, between 1995 and 2024 from $180 in 2017 PPP in 1995 to $1,400 in 2017 PPP, which is like a huge increase. And this situates Lithuania also among the top poverty improvers. So here we can see that really income is the main determinant of poverty reduction. On the other hand, we see on the left graph the countries that had the highest deteriorations in mean income at the household level, where we have Yemen, Venezuela, Malawi, Syria, etc. These countries had the highest deteriorations in poverty globally. So, for example, Yemen had its rank increase from 105 to 169, which means that now it's almost the country with the highest poverty rates globally. And again, it's 169, which means that it's the country with the lowest, income per capita globally, and it is also the country with the highest poverty rates globally. Again, here we see the reflection of the poverty from the household income when we talk about it. And interestingly, I wanted to highlight Malawi's case again, where it is the third country with the highest income deterioration, where the income decreased from 133 to 59, which means that it's almost cut in half on average, which is a huge reduction in income at the household level. However, again, we did not see a rise in poverty in Malawi, which is also attributed to the inequality part, where there has been a more equal distribution in Malawi over the years, which mitigated the effect of income collapse on poverty rises. Here we can see the relationship between the macroeconomy and the microeconomy, which means that the income at the national level and income at the household level. On the x-axis, we have GDP per capita. On the y-axis, we have mean household income per capita. Of course, there's a very strong relationship between the two, but we see that GDP is higher than mean household income across all countries, which is like expected because in surveys we have misreporting or underreporting of the richest, which may decrease the mean income on average. And this also has driven us to innovate in the creation of the pass-through ratio, which has improved our projections methodology. So our projections now not only rely on the growth of the macroeconomy or of the income at the of the GDP, but also on how much this growth is translated to growth in household income, where we did a study using many countries and we used the clustering method in order to find the amount of pass-through of growth at the national level to growth at the household level. And here, obviously, we can find that, for example, North America, which is the gray box plot, the gray one, has the highest pass-through among all the regions, and also, of course, the least variability because they are like a fewer number of countries. And also, we have Latin America has a good or a high pass-through ratio, which is the growth reflected to household income, and it's on average 82%. East Europe also has a high pass-through, but also a high variability across countries. So again, this not only allows us to better project income at the household at the household level and to project poverty, but also to understand this relationship and to like guide policymakers in order to improve this transmission and to make the growth more inclusive.
Thank you.
Like main conclusions, if you want, that growth is a very important driver in the poverty story, and it is like particularly income growth at the household level that is more important than the macroeconomic growth. But of course, macroeconomic growth is very important, but policymakers have to find a way in order to translate this to the household level and to reduce poverty in order not to allow only the richest to reap the benefits of this growth. And I will leave the floor to my colleague Vlad in order to elaborate on inequality as another driver of poverty.
Okay, so we focus 2 chapters on these direct, immediate determinants of poverty, the growth of incomes and distribution of incomes, and so now the one extra challenge with distribution is that we have less data available on it because we take distribution straight from household surveys, whereas income level and income growth we could use extrapolations, projections from UN and other sources, but distribution we have to project ourselves. So we developed a model for that, and there's one background paper that we've shared where we take existing estimates of distribution across household surveys, and we project backward, we project between surveys, and we project forward to 2024 as well as 2030 for the following chapters. So using these estimates of distribution, specifically Gini coefficients, here we start looking at the association between poverty trends and inequality trends. And the central finding here is looking at the growth rate in poverty rates versus growth rates in the Gini coefficient. The relationship is weaker from what we saw in the previous chapter with growth. So both in terms of the fitted line, the elasticity of poverty reduction to change in reduction in inequality.
Sorry, just a clarification. What period?
95 through 2024. Okay. And as well as the spread around the fitted line that we just showed here for reference. Okay. Now, so that's the central finding, that if we're thinking, is it growth or is it equalizing, some equalizing process over time? It's clear to us that the growth of the whole income distribution is far more important than changing the shape of the distribution.
So the fact that the growth is in the denominator of the inequality measure, doesn't that get you to rethink what you're saying? I mean, is it, because it's the denominator of most inequality measures is the mean income, and the numerator is some other measure like the same measure.
I'll tell you what we're thinking in order to respond to this. We are going to do a decomposition exercise. So that's on my mind. I knew that was going to come. So we're gonna prepare with the decomposition.
Khaled, can people please speak to the mic so we can understand online, so we can hear better?
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Can we get the mic closer, maybe to Vlad?
That's okay. I'll try to. Anyway, it's a very short
tail on the owl.
Anyway, just to present a few trends for what we find on inequality, we find that in most countries worldwide, inequality has been falling. I think that's a common narrative, that inequality worldwide was rising until the mid-90s or so, and then we didn't choose the starting period, 1995, strategically. But it turns out that it's the point where inequality started falling, and that's exactly what we document throughout this analysis.
You won't be allowed in Paris with this.
Yes,
okay.
Piketty crowd is not like this.
So comparing inequality 95 and 2024, you see that the vast majority of countries are under the 45-degree line, showing decrease of inequality. We also see that just combining a little bit the evidence from this chapter and previous chapter, so how did the countries fare in terms of level of income and distribution of income for the majority of countries in these 30 years? We see improvement in both dimensions, growing mean income or expenditure and reduction in inequality. That's a common finding. Looking at individual world regions and country income groups, we see actually this is a global process. Everywhere we see the reduction in inequality.
An important clarification, this is not the aggregated regional distribution, this is the population
country level.
Country level, okay, so...
Oh, but then it's Gini.
It is Gini.
National Gini.
National Gini.
Weighted by national population.
But we cannot do that because the Gini index is not decomposable.
Yes, and that's why I'm mentioning. It's just
theoretically not correct.
We are just for presentation, so that's why I mentioned.
But in the report also we have weighted population weighted.
Yes,
I think
it's for simplicity's sake. Okay. This is not an academic report, but okay. I agree with you. You're absolutely. That's why I'm mentioning it.
Okay, so
okay. So then the inference becomes different.
Yeah, I mean it's basically the average. What happens?
Well, it's inequality
is perceived. Must be more because they are between and within. Yes. So the inequality must be higher.
But we don't talk. We think that all of these processes are at the country level.
Yeah, but
so and experienced by national individuals, and that's why.
By region, it is aggregated. This is the question. By country, we have no problem.
So we're talking about inequality as experienced by average national in a region.
Because policies, Tuhami, happen at the national level, and that's what matters. You know, I mean, if I aggregate at the regional level, okay, what does that mean?
No, but now the outcome is that inequality is falling.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then it becomes the narrative might not be appropriate.
Falling within countries, not falling in the whole region. They're different concepts.
It's different regions. Yeah, exactly. But within the regions becomes is not appropriate.
Yes, exactly.
There might be divergence across countries, but convergence.
We can't
just remove that graph.
No, but we can't
remove it, just interpret it.
Yeah, we can't have saying that the regions, whoever it's our region or other regions, inequality is falling.
No. Correct.
Particularly, it isn't. I mean, what are the right weights for the Gini anyway? So it's a little bit more complicated even beyond.
Exactly.
So overall, among countries, it is majority.
Yeah. Okay. The only kind of two exceptions we can see on this graph that in South Asia inequality hasn't budged much, and East Asia and the Pacific also actually inequalities slightly increased in the countries in the region. So, but it stayed essentially same 0.36. But otherwise, the trend is worldwide that the distribution within countries across different groups of countries has decreased to some extent. We do a small box on growth incidence curves in selected countries, and in the majority of countries we see pro-poor growth, incomes increasing most at the lowest quantiles of the national distribution. One notable exception is China, where we also saw I forgot to point out that somewhere here we would find China somewhere with slightly increasing inequality.
Yes, and the first quarter.
Okay, and we see it also for using the dashed line of the growth incidence curve. Again, slightly the incomes have picked up a little bit more for the poorest, but also a little bit more for the highest groups. Last slide from me so if we think of the elasticity of poverty reduction to either income growth or inequality reduction, we see the systematic relationship, well known that in richer countries, the elasticity of poverty reduction to inequality reduction is stronger than, I said, in richer countries,
yes,
than to growth. While in the poorest countries, it's the growth that matters particularly more compared to inequality reduction.
You can also see that in the ISO plots, which we will present in the next session.
And just a final check of, income is not the only money metric variable that we could consider. And so in the direction of studying the multidimensional causes of poverty, we also evaluated wealth inequality, and overall we cross-sectionally we have a positive, we have the expected relationship between income inequality and wealth inequality. Countries with higher income inequality tend to have higher wealth inequality, but in terms of change over time, we see a more complicated picture. We think it has to do with how the nationals of countries cope with growth and crises. So whereas income inequality might be falling over time in countries, wealth inequality could just be rising. The rich people don't dissave even in times of crises. They keep accumulating wealth, while it's the poor people who dissave in terms of
I think
crises.
the Paris crowd is going to like this graph,
More than the other one.
more than
And this is clearly, an area that we could dwell more on.
Okay. I think that concludes our presentations for the day. There's no more information that we have to offer. But it does point out to what you mentioned, Chico, that these surveys miss out on the very rich. We know that. And by how much, it's anybody's guess. What we have are the surveys. And the surveys tell us that we have declining Gini's. And that's the story. What happens to the ultra-rich, that's the Piketty narrative, it's not invoked here. Not because it's irrelevant, it is relevant, but it's irrelevant for the purposes of this report. In other reports, it is very relevant, and especially when you try to correct for that. But that's another discussion. It's just not part of this report's main focus. But we acknowledge it. It is an important issue. It's just not an important issue for this particular report and the arguments it is trying to make. I think we have Sanjay, who just left as the discussant. So I don't know what
we can talk about that.
Let me just, what I will be doing very quickly is, first I will set a little bit the context of my comment, telling you a little bit about the Luxembourg income study, and then I will give you some comments on the report, and carry on with a simple exercise I did using your poverty lines, but on our data to end with some conclusions and suggestions. So why do I want to tell you about LIS? Just to, for those who don't know about LIS, to tell you that we mostly focus on high and upper middle income countries, so that may have a relevance with what I will say. The Luxembourg Income Study Database contains harmonized microdata files on income and wealth. And from the very beginning, we were focused mostly on high-income countries. Progressively, we have expanded to upper middle-income countries, and recently to lower middle-income countries. But still, all our methodology are really fit for mostly high and upper middle-income countries. So today we have 53 advanced and emerging economies, spanning a period from the 1960s to nowadays. And the data are used remotely by about 1,000 researchers every year, everywhere around the world. And the main purpose is to carry out comparative research. It's comparative both over time and especially across countries. So we do have some inequality, and most notably in this case, poverty key figures, which have been a reference since their creation exactly 40 years ago. And just let me tell you how we measure poverty and how we have always been measuring poverty. So first of all, the well-being measure is household disposable income. We use a relative poverty line, which is 50% of the median. We use the square root of the equivalent scale, square root of the household size as the equivalent scale. And our poverty key figures are disaggregated by various groups of the populations. This is the world coverage in LIS. You can see a clear bias towards rich countries.
Yeah, just to tell you, we're still on the first slide here, Teresa. So
Then you clearly don't see what I can see. That's very weird.
No,
I'm
we
not
don't.
sure how to. Wait, let's see.
Yeah, now we have it. That's fine.
Good. Oh no.
No. Well, I just unshared. Then let me share again. You had it for a moment.
We did. It was really exciting.
I'm really sorry. For some reason, we don't have the same script. Do you see some? Oh, wait. Do you see something now?
Teresa, just send it to us. We will.
I see.
Beautiful.
Now we can.
Yes.
Beautiful.
We can see the content. Yes.
Yeah, it works.
Oh, okay. I don't know what changed. Okay, fine.
Now yes. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the one you didn't see before, but I told you already. So that's the coverage of the list data, where you can clearly see a bias towards rich income countries, high income countries, and to some extent middle income countries. Now, this is our typical measure of the poverty rate. As I said, this is relative, and this works well for, let's say, our countries. The poverty rate span from 5 to 25 in this chart. But then if you look at the only low-income countries that we have, which is Mali, you will see that it stands right in the middle of the ranking, which does sound awkward if you think about poverty in Mali with respect to many other richer countries which are further down this ranking. And here we clearly see why the relative poverty rates do no longer work when enlarging the countries to poorer countries. So now moving on to the ESCO report. First of all, I found it very well written, very clearly motivated in the first couple of chapters. It's very comprehensive. The nice thing is that you went beyond the region, obviously with a very large world coverage. That's, I would say, almost unique and very appreciated. It is a very welcome addition to the ongoing discussion on the need for a new global poverty measure. I found that the first, second or third chapter, they had a very thorough account of global poverty trends, and then later on the association of the poverty trends with growth and redistribution. It is clearly a useful alternative perspective to the analysis produced by the World Bank, since I would say it's most possibly the only other report that covers the whole world, basically almost the whole world. And it's very nice that it had this comprehensive appendix with all the data for all the single countries on the poverty lines. It's thanks to that appendix that I was then able to do the simple exercise I will show you in a minute. So overall, well done. I was not the only one to look into it, at least, and we were all impressed with the report. A few, if I can say, critics now, starting from the poverty line itself. We clearly know that going into weekly relative poverty is very important, but still it's very important to stress that what is really top priority is the eradication of absolute poverty, which could come up a little bit clearer in the report at the beginning, I believe. I think this was said, certainly James mentioned it, but it was mentioned again that the data used, the methodology, especially used underlying the creation of the poverty line, is very unclear. I ended up going to the background paper. It's okay that then it was clear, but you cannot pretend that readers of the reports go look into the other papers, technical papers, to understand. And I think it's really necessary in this report. In addition, even once one reads the paper, the technical paper, the poverty line is not very intuitive, and this is maybe, unfortunately, the major critique to this poverty line, because when it is not intuitive, intuitively clear, it can be difficult to communicate and can often not be readily understood by larger audiences. Moving on to the poverty estimates, the major, you acknowledge that obviously, but we still find that it's a serious major problem with the report is the fact that it's based on group data. So the poverty estimates that you carry out are based on group data rather than microdata. This, we think, really significantly reduces the appeal of the reports. One other point is that the welfare measure used, while you use income or consumption, mixing them, which already is slightly problematic, but I know that it's a question of availability. Still, you could say something else about what definition of income, what definition of consumption, what is included in those two aggregates. Are they really comparable in the reports? The overall message about the estimates, starting from the title, is maybe a little bit more pessimistic than it should be. You do say that moderate poverty and vulnerability has increased over that period, but still, because of the decrease in the extreme and poverty, if you look at simply the non-poor, the share of non-poor, they have increased after all in the period. So I'm not sure that the overall message should be as pessimistic as you give it. Moving on to the drivers of poverty. Well, again, the methodology are absolutely not explained. I didn't go to the paper about the pass-through ratio to read how it is calculated, so I have no clue how you calculated it, just reading the report. Growth and inequality, yes, we obviously know that they are clear drivers of poverty. Still, what you present in the report are simply associations or correlations all throughout the report. They do not necessarily denote a clear causal effect. I still believe that those numbers were extremely useful and extremely that they can tell a lot, but I would refrain from mentioning that they are drivers in the way you present them. I think this was said over and over, just measuring Gini as a measure of inequality can be misleading. Maybe you could also, first of all, have decomposed it, but also used other inequality measures that would focus a little bit on the bottom part of the population, since that's their overall target here. And one last point is that all of those charts, they measure growth across the period 95 to 24, just by looking, if I understand well, at the 2 points, 95 and 2024, whereas depending on what happened in those two specific years, you might get a growth which does not necessarily capture what has happened during the years in between. So we have often seen that using all of the years and trends rather than just growth over two periods could be much better. Now, moving on the simple exercise, as I call it, this is the same chart I showed you before with our relative poverty rates, and where I colored in, what is that, orange, the non-high income countries. So from upper middle to low, with a always more intense color. As you can see, we only have one low income country, that's Mali, right in the middle of the chart. Now, using the absolute poverty rate, the $2.15 a day, we can see that immediately all of the low and middle income countries move to the right of the chart. What we can also see is that clearly this absolute poverty line doesn't help at all to compare rich countries. We know that. That's the problem of the purely absolute poverty rates. And that's why moving into weekly relative is very useful when one wants to compare countries of very different economic development. And this is what we get with the ESCWA poverty rate. Now, I prefer this picture much more than the other two, clearly. Now you can see that Mali, the darker spar, has moved way down to the right of the chart. Most of the low-income countries are to the right, but not all of them. there's still some variety. What I also like is that the poverty rates, the range is much higher. We are now spanning from just above 0 to over 60, whereas with the relatives, they were much closer to each other all over. Just for your info, I also calculated the same with the societal poverty rates of the World Bank. The ranking is very similar, but the spread is much smaller. So now, this is now using the same scale. You can see that the poverty rates are much more in line. Now I'm putting them all together. This chart is not extremely easy, but I still want to show it to you because, well, first of all, you can see the red line is the absolute at $2.15 a day, completely useless. Oh, sorry, I should mention that in this case, the x-axis is the median household income per capita. So the more to the right, the richer the countries are. The red line for the purely absolute at 2.15 becomes almost useless for the richer countries. When the black line is the relative, as the relative is, I'm not saying that it's horizontal, but there is much less of a declining trend. The poverties are a little higher at the beginning, but not so much higher than in the rest of the countries. So that again tells us that it's maybe not the right measure to compare different countries of different economic development. Now the ESCWA line, which is the green line, it follows quite well the relative for the richest countries, but it's very different for the low-income countries. Same is true for the societal poverty line, but the societal follows much more closely the relative, especially at the top, but to some extent even at the bottom. One thing I would like to note is that something I don't understand is that the ESCWA line is the only one of the three lines that once in a while has some weird some things I don't understand. So there are some typical outliers, like we see the USA very rich, but with a relatively high poverty range. The same is true for the two Mediterranean countries here, Italy and Spain. Down at the bottom, it's harder for me. The country that is very much at the bottom here, which is Georgia, is not the one that is at the bottom, so with the lowest poverty rate for the other three lines. So there is something different about the ESCWA poverty lines, where these exceptions end up with these exceptional countries end up with really different poverties. I would like to understand more why this happens. Georgia in the societal poverty rate is up here, so it really goes in the opposite direction. It increases rather than decreasing, like in the ESCWA poverty line. So some conclusions. I really believe that those ESCWA poverty rates are very useful to compare across high, middle, and low-income countries. They're extremely useful to get a global overview and to get overviews of the different regions of the world. Still, I believe that it's far less for individual country policymakers. A more minor remark is that it would be useful to see in the report difference not only with respect to the societal rate as you do, but also to relative and absolute other poverty lines to see how you find, which differences you find with respect to other poverty lines. I cannot but emphasize how important it would be to use microdata, and at least for some countries, I know you don't have microdata for all of the countries, but at least for some countries, just do some case studies. You could, for example, do some poverty mapping exercise to test the validity of the measure. You could decompose by subgroup of the populations in order to help better target policies. Decompose for income subcomponents to try to measure the distribution effects in a different way than simply by correlating it with the growth in Gini or the decrease in Gini. As well as calculate poverty for different measures of well-being, not only income or consumption, but wealth and non-money metric as you do it at the end, but try to put them together and use the poverty line, the ESCO poverty line in that case. Some comments about more technical about terminology and reporting. Well, I already said that I believe to tone down the claim of causality between growth inequality and poverty. There are maybe too many numbers and charts across the reports, always repeating exactly the same pictures, first for the total group, then for the repeating for the different income groups and the different, your 4 groups that you create. Maybe you should only show the most significant ones in the report and report and comment only those ones and put everything else in the appendix. You use the term vulnerability when very often in the literature, at least in high-income countries, it's used with respect to the persistence of poverty in a dynamic setup, which is not what you do, so that could be misleading. I would definitely add a detailed appendix on data and methodology. We've already said that. And it would also be very, very useful if there was a small tool where we could extract all of those poverty lines. I had to do that manually for my little exercise just to copy them from the appendix. But also a tool where we could visualize the rates and put them in different formats and with selecting countries and years, for example. I think I will stop it there. I had 2 or 3 other slides for examples, but maybe they could come up during the discussion.
Thank you so much. You'll see the tool if you hang around for another hour or so. So we have a presentation specifically dedicated to that tool. Lots of very, very useful comments, and thank you so much. But before we reply, giving the floor to my dear friend, Professor Sanjay Reddy from the New School.
Thank you very much, Khalid. I would like to mention that Khalid is a graduate of our institution, so we will take credit for him.
That is correct.
I'd like to congratulate the team and also the Executive Secretary of the FESQUA. I think that it's a very good initiative to think about global issues from a regional perspective and to begin a dialogue about the appropriateness of the global framework for the region, and also hopefully to contribute something from the region to the global discussion. And I think that that doesn't happen enough. ECLA was mentioned before. That was, of course, a very important contributor in an earlier moment to a global discussion. And some of the concepts that ECLA has developed over the years, such as the idea of an extreme poverty line, could perhaps play an even bigger role in the global discussion, and to some extent they have been incorporated. So I would say that this is a welcome development. Salim and I were talking a little bit earlier about how the various UN research institutions are not really functioning in the way that they once were in terms of producing big ideas and contributions. So I think it's nice to have this level of ambition, right? Now, as far as the specifics of whether everything that you're doing is being done in exactly the right way, there's already been a robust discussion. We can continue that. But I'd like to just appreciate that there is an ambition here, and I think that that's appropriate. I don't think that the World Bank and UNDP, which doesn't do very much of that anymore, just because they sit in Washington and New York, should be the only entities that set the terms of this discussion. Okay. Let me step back a little bit and look at the conceptual framework which one might think appropriate to such an exercise as a way of helping to clarify what kind of an exercise this is. And in that connection, I'd like to refer to Amartya Sen's famous, at least famous among some of us, right, response to Peter Townsend in his essay called Poor Relatively Speaking, where he talks about poverty as a concept which is to be viewed appropriately as absolute in the space of capabilities and relative in the space of commodities. And of course, he was talking about what we now call income poverty in that particular article. That was much before, in fact, his own work on what we might now call multidimensional poverty indices. So there was a recognition that insofar as one is doing income poverty analysis, and I would argue, and I think his view also was that it certainly has a role to play, one should motivate it appropriately in terms of capabilities, right? So what is income poverty? I would say that it's a failure to establish basic capabilities that arises for reason of inadequate command over resources, whether by market or non-market means. Now, there may be other kinds of capability failure, there certainly are out there, which have to do with failures of public provisioning, for instance. And sometimes there are overlaps as to what kinds of failures are involved. But this would be one way, and I think it's a way which follows directly from his original response to Peter Townsend as to how we might think about what income poverty is. So from this standpoint, we should define the poverty line in terms of what are the requirements of establishing the relevant basic capabilities. And whether or not we can do that in any one context, so to speak, from first principles through a detailed analysis, that's ultimately what we are conceptually aiming for, right? And I think if we think about it this way, it will help to contextualize the exercise, to motivate the exercise, and also to understand better what are the areas of overlap or non-overlap between the income poverty concern and non-income poverty concerns, which are directly arrived at through exercises that look at outcomes in non-income poverty domains, as the multidimensional poverty indices that are used often do, not exclusively, but often. Okay. Now, I would interpret Sen's response to Townsend as simply rejecting the idea that there is a distinction to be made between absolute poverty and relative poverty, because the relativity is with respect to what commodities are required to attain a given set of capabilities, and only in that way. Okay. Let's move from there to your exercise. What you have done is to draw on national poverty lines, as to use James's word, an anchor. Now, you're not alone in having done that. The World Bank does that, after all. That's how they have always motivated, or at least that's been one major way in which they have motivated their so-called absolute poverty lines, by claiming that they are representative in some way of, and I'm quoting directly from Revalian, Chen, and Sangraula here, perceptions of poverty in poor countries. Okay. And it seems to me that what you're doing is not entirely different. Right? So let me first discuss whether or not national poverty lines, which are the input to both exercises, actually reflect perceptions of poverty in poor countries, and then I will go on to talk about whether